Hi, this is Phoenix, and I'm going to briefly talk about conscious realism as posited by Hoffman, and then I'm going to briefly analyze it as well, essentially think through the implications. So I will dive right in. The position is that reality is essentially observer dependent, and one of the lines of evidence to support this claim lies in quantum mechanics, which is the idea that a lot of quantum mechanics is observer dependent. So essentially, we can only make sense of quantum particles and how the quantum realm actually works whenever we look at our role in observing the microscopic and the peculiarities that exist therein. Conscious realism pretty much implies then that because we are observer dependent, or because reality is observer dependent, that we don't essentially see reality as it actually is. And this is because it relies on evolutionary theory and evolution itself to make the claim that essentially that we are trained to not see reality as it literally looks, but as it would make the most sense to us in order to allow us to survive and to adapt to our environment. So the metaphor or the analogy is to one of an organism in a niche, and basically they only need enough information in order to adapt to that niche in order to function in that niche, and they don't need excess details about how reality is and what reality actually looks like. So essentially, fitness is more important than accuracy, ultimately. And so all of this indeed gets complex really, really fast, because essentially conscious realism is a rejection of Newtonian mechanics, which is that there is an object independent of you, there is an objective physical world, and this is a very troubling claim when it comes a very troubling claim that challenges Newtonian mechanics, because it essentially says that reality is not objective per se, but that it is rather dependent on the conscious agents that are perceiving reality as it is. So as Hoffman has said, essentially reality only makes sense because of the observer, and as he says specifically, the physical world, whatever that may be, doesn't really exist without the conscious observer. Now, there's a lot of interesting counter-arguments to conscious realism, specifically as postulated by Hoffman, and some of these claims deal with the absurdity of not accepting that there is actually a physical objective world. But if you think about it, and I'm going to side with conscious realism here, claims that try to say that there is an objective world are really just materialist claims, and I naturally have a bias towards materialism because I feel that it limits the way that we can view the world, and I feel that it limits the way that we can understand existence in our reality. And so essentially what conscious realism is trying to do is to show how important the conscious agent is for forming reality. So essentially, when you observe something, basically what you are seeing is something that is suitable to the task of interaction and of moving forward and of interacting in general, but it doesn't necessarily represent it as it actually is. This is because there seems to be a disconnect between the way objective reality is, between the objective reality as it is towards the conscious observer, and that's where the disconnection is. But that's exactly why there's so much emphasis on the conscious agent, because the conscious agent is what filters the information and tries to create representations of what actually exists, suitable to the task. So, so the point is that it's not necessarily that Hoffman is saying that an objective world doesn't exist, but that the way that we look at the objective world needs to change, because the conscious agent is extremely important to how one interacts with the world and to what actually exists. There's more quantum evidence to suggest, there's more evidence within quantum mechanics to suggest that conscious realism is true, and that's when you look at a table or a chair, it doesn't actually exist because it's really just atoms existing in their peculiar way, atoms essentially in their superposition and not really making up their mind as to where they want to be, and in a sense not really existing. So you might be wondering, does this collapse into solipsism? Hoffman has said that he doesn't rely on Berkeley's idealism, and that he's actually very different from idealism. Though I'm still thinking through how that is the case, except that really it would be because there is an emphasis on the disconnect between what a person actually sees and what actually exists, and how what the person sees is infinitely more important than what actually exists. The analogy that's used is one of a computer icon. So the computer icon essentially, such as a recycle bin or a file, exists to show what is there and what you can do with the computer, but that doesn't represent what exactly is going on with the computer. And this is a great analogy for how conscious realism works, in that essentially we don't need to see reality as it actually is, because it is essentially a distraction. So to go back to my point on solipsism, I would say that this isn't necessarily solipsism because it's not denying that there are other conscious agents. In fact, it's not denying that at all. It's just putting the emphasis on the conscious agents themselves. So what can I ultimately say about this? Well, I will admit that it's difficult to say because, as you can tell, with me speaking about this, it's very difficult to work through. It's very difficult to think through because they're very counterintuitive notions, and in a lot of ways they don't make a lot of sense. And we want to constantly use our materialist conceptions, our Newtonian conceptions, to debunk all of these claims. But I find it invigorating and empowering and refreshing, and essentially an antidote to modern science, to see conscious realism as the way things actually work, because, as I've been saying, it puts so much emphasis on ourselves as conscious agents with the creation and interaction with reality itself. And so essentially, as I like to do in my philosophy, I like to come up with claims and come up with proofs about how we can manipulate our reality in creative ways, in ways that can allow us to flourish in life, and not looking at the table, for instance, as just a table, or not looking at the chair as just a chair. This is an old problem with metaphysics, with trying to understand reality essentially and trying to bend that reality, which is what scientists essentially try to do by trying to manipulate the objective world. But essentially conscious realism, with its claims, tries to show that this version of science is outdated, and that we essentially need to get up to speed and start looking at the conscious agent as an important part to how reality operates. And I think that that's very invigorating and very powerful, because it means that even if we think that the table is set, we have to understand that there's a lot more to it, and that we're not necessarily seeing reality as it actually is. And that's very freeing because it shows the complexities that actually exist and the complexities that we can explore. And so to close, I would say that this is remarkable in shifting our notions of what reality is, because it shows that we can't see reality as it actually is, because it's much more complex than we can ever understand. But how that's important for appreciating reality as it is, for making a metaphysical stance and saying that reality is essentially and inherently very complex, and there is much that can be done and much that can be accomplished. I hope you enjoyed this talk. This is Phoenix, and thank you.